What is the Sabbath day? Can you violate the Sabbath day? If you mowed your yard, cleaned dishes, or picked up sticks on a Sunday, do you deserve to die? Hello, my name is Trey Talley. I'm the pastor of the church at Pecan Creek located in Denton, Texas. To quickly answer that, before we go forward, the answer is no. So please do not go out and stone your neighbor as they're mowing their yard on a Sunday. But why is the answer no? And that's what we're going to explore today. We've been teaching through the book of Hebrews. This last Sunday, we were in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. That deals a lot with the Sabbath. So we took that time to look through the rest of Scripture to see what the Sabbath was, who it was given to, and what it means for us today. So if this has been a foggy issue in your life, or a little bit of a lack of clarity, please feel free to listen in, re-listen to this. It's a teaching that is oftentimes just kind of avoided today. So let us begin. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. By the way, I preached on this Sunday, and it was the longest sermon I've ever preached. And this may be a long video, but I'll try to make it as quickly through it as I possibly can. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11, the author says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also entered from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of obedience." Now, Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4 have spoken a lot about God's redeeming Israel from Egypt, setting them free from the bondage of that slavery, and how they had fallen short of the promised land. And as they were on the verge of going into the promised land, they rebelled against God. They were cursed to have 40 years in the desert until every one of those 20 years and up died. The next leader after Moses was going to be Joshua. Joshua did lead them into the promised land, but yet the author of Hebrews says that there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. In other words, now we're talking many years later, the author is saying that was not it. That is not complete. That rest that God was talking about is a much higher, it's a spiritual rest. And to the author of Hebrews audience and to us today, it still remains. And we must make sure that we are going to enter into that rest and not fall short. So again, many people came out of Egypt. The Israelites exited out, the great Exodus, but very few entered into the promised land. And he offers that challenge to us in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. He says, hey, do not fall short. You must enter into that rest. And that rest is ultimately going to be in and through the person of Jesus Christ. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Let me fast forward kind of quickly to get through some of this today. What is the Sabbath is going to be extremely important to look at for the next few moments. For instance, we understand from the Old Testament that the Sabbath was the seventh day, and it was not Sunday as we treat it these days. But in the Old Testament, that was the Sabbath day, and there were multiple Sabbaths. You had the weekly rest. You had a 7-year rest where you had to take the year off. And then every 7 cycles of that Sabbath, the 50th year, you had this super Sabbath, the year of Jubilee, that they were supposed to rest on and rely on the provision of God. But we don't see this word Sabbath really mentioned anywhere in the earliest part of the Bible. We see it in Genesis, and then there's just generations and generations where it is not mentioned at all. So we're going to cover those quickly today. Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." So here we do see that God has completed that work of creation and that he rests. Now some people will use this verse to say that mankind was also commanded to rest and to have a seventh day rest, because it states here that God stopped his work on the seventh day. However, that is added to the text, and we don't see that anywhere in the text that I just read of Genesis 2, 1 through 3. And many people later on in the mid-1600s created confessions of faith, and they inserted that here, that the Sabbath day goes all the way back to creation, and that mankind has always had to honor the Sabbath day and to rest on that day. But as we see, that's not the case. And a lot of times it's Reformed Christians, in which we are at the church at Pecan Creek. But if you go back to the early reformers like Martin Luther, like John Calvin, even back to Augustine, earlier than him, even going back to Ignatius, no one believed that to be the case. That came up much later. So let's look when it is first mentioned. So all those generations go by. It's never mentioned with Adam, with Enoch, with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. It's not mentioned at all until Moses. So Moses has taken the people out of Israel, and God has been providing for them all along. He's provided for them the supernatural signs and miracles and wonders, the plagues that came upon Egypt and the Red Sea splitting in half, and just sign after sign. He's provided for them water. He's provided for them nourishment too, as we see here. So Exodus chapter 16, 22 through 30. On the sixth day, speaking of the manna, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all this is left over, lay aside to be kept till morning." So this is the first time the word Sabbath is used here and commanded of people, and is strictly to the Israelites. So they laid it aside till morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there was no worms. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it. On the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some people went out together, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. So here we definitely see this lesson that God is imposing on them early on during this Exodus, as they've left Egypt on their way to the promised land. God says, "Rest in my provision." He's given them that command to gather enough bread for that next day. There will be no other bread there. They should not work, but yet some of them still did. And God says that they shouldn't do that. They should rest in Him and His supernatural provision that He is giving them. All right, so that's the first mention. Next mention, Exodus 31, we see a great mention here of the Sabbath. Verse 12 through 17. "And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths." And again, it is plural, not singular, because it's not just one day. It is yearly, and then the big year of Jubilee, as we see also. He says, "For this is a sign between you and me throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you." Okay, so He's given these Sabbaths to the people of Israel as a sign that God is the one who sanctifies them, who purifies them. He goes on to say, verse 14, "You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, their soul shall be that soul shall be cut off from his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath through their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed." So here we see it's a punishment by death if someone works on the Sabbath day. This is why I posed that question early on. Is it okay to mow your yard on the Sabbath day? Is it okay to clean dishes, to pick up sticks? God says people of Israel were to be put to death if they worked on that day. So they were to rely on the rest in God, His provision for them, because this day was a sign of the covenant that God had made with them. And to violate that was to reject God and to reject the covenant that he had made there with Israel. So we find that all of the Sabbaths are equally a part of God's law to Israel, and they are to honor all of them. And later on we see that Israel actually did not keep the 7-year Sabbaths, and they were kicked out of the promised land by God for not obeying his law. So why did this law breaking, or why did breaking the Sabbath require execution? Again, because it is an absolute rejection of the clear sign that God had given to Israel. And it was not a joking matter. It was no little deal. People were to be put to death. We fast forward to the book of Numbers, chapter 15, 32 through 36. And sure enough, there's a man who is picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and God tells them to put him to death. They gathered around him and they stoned him to death because he had rejected God. He had rejected the covenant that God had made with them, and he deserved death. So it's extremely serious. So a lot of times these Sabbath day rules and regulations in the Old Testament and the consequences for them, we in the New Testament don't exactly know what to do with them. This is why it's important to understand that this was a sign, the covenant God made with Israel, and it was a sign of the Old Covenant. You as a Christian are not under the Old Covenant. You as a Christian are not part of those people who have come out of Exodus. You are under the new covenant of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, the law, the rules that were given there, you might say, were for those people. And there's a lot of rules and regulations there. Some of them transcend over, of course, into the New Testament. We have 9 out of 10 of what we refer to as the 10 Commandments that are passed on over into the New Testament. However, one is not, and it is the Sabbath. And that is highly significant. In fact, as we go through the New Testament, just to kind of skip ahead a little bit here, we get to Colossians 2, 16 through 17, and listen to what Paul says about the Sabbath. He says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." Now this is way different from what we just read. We've just read that it was punishable by death if they worked on the Sabbath. However, here Paul says, let no one pass judgment on you. And this is the same teaching that's picked up that we see in the rest of the New Testament. These things were a shadow. They were not the substance. They were not the real. And he puts Sabbaths in the same category as the dietary guidelines, as the new moon sacrifices, the sacrifices that had to be performed at the beginning of each month, that were part of the rules, the laws that were given there to the Israelites, and also the feast. They had 7 required feasts that had to be taken every single year. And all this was part of those rules, the regulations that God had given to Israel. However, now, Paul says, those were shadows of the real thing. And now the real thing has come. So we find all of that as a type, as a shadow, kind of like prophecy, pointing to the one that would come and fulfill all of that. So that is what happens with the Sabbaths as well, with the sacrifices. Do we still need to sacrifice animals at the beginning of every month? No. Why? Because that was under the Old Covenant. Now we're under the New Covenant. Do we need to take the 7 feasts every single year as required by God's rules and regulations and laws that He gave to Israel? No, because that was a shadow of the substance to come. So it is with the Sabbath, okay? The Sabbath is Christ. We rest in Him because He has achieved spiritual provision, salvation for our souls, and that is where we find our Sabbath. That's how we enter into the rest of God, and how we will enter into the true and ultimate final promised land is through Jesus Christ. A couple other verses just quickly here regarding this. Paul also goes on in Romans 14, 4 through 6 to say this, "Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day, observe it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. Very quickly, you may have missed this point as we read it right then, but in other words, he says, hey, some of you are still esteeming certain days higher than other days. He says, that's fine if you want to, but we shouldn't pass judgment on one another for doing this. In other words, if you want to esteem a certain day higher than another one, like a Sabbath, you can, but there is no need to do so. So this is quite a change from the Old Testament of stoning someone to death if they did not esteem the Sabbath day as they were supposed to. And we see this over and over in the Old Testament compared to the New Testament. As we get to the New Testament, we find that this is a new covenant that has been made. This is what Jesus Christ's point was. Even on the night of his crucifixion, we take the Lord's Supper now. Why do we do that? Because actually he did that and installed that on the Passover feast, the required feast of the Jews, the first feast that they were required to take. And all of a sudden, Jesus changes it into the Lord's Supper. And the whole point of it is, even the feast, it is in Christ that feast, what it was pointing to, the shadow of it, is fulfilled. How is the wrath of God going to pass over you? It's because God has sent his Lamb to pay the price, to be the sacrifice, to receive his wrath, so that God's wrath will pass over you. All right? So all those feasts point to Christ. All the sacrifices in the Old Testament point to Christ. And so does this Sabbath. Can you break the Sabbath now? You can break the Sabbath now, but it's not like you would think. Remember, the shadow is pointing to something real, more real, and increase the substance. You break the Sabbath day now by thinking that you can work your way into God's rest. It is impossible, and you will die, and not just physical death, but spiritual death. How you keep the Sabbath day now is by resting in the one who worked for your salvation, the only one who is righteous, the only one who has never sinned, the only one that has fulfilled all righteousness, the one who God has sent and said, rest in him. Jesus is our rest. So today, that is my encouragement to you. How do you get into the promised land? How do you get into God's ultimate rest? Through the person of rest. We enter into the place of rest by being on the path of rest, by entering through the door of rest, and all of that is through Jesus Christ. So think about those things today. Sorry it went so long, and I will attach the sermon to the end of this in case you want to look more into this subject. Thanks for listening.